Hey everybody, and welcome along to this very, very special Rangers Rabble podcast. The third one we've done now with Rangers author, I always like saying that to him, Davy Herd. I'm going to discuss his third Rangers book. It's 3 books inside a year, which is fairly good going. This book here, which I know if you're listening to this on audio you won't be able to see, 1977 to 78. A historic season for Rangers FC and a treble that ended an era, with a foreword by the one and only Alex McDonald. So, Davey, let's start off. First of all, thanks a lot for doing this for us today.
Oh, my pleasure. It's good to talk to you again.
And you, right. So, Alex McDonald, forward, how did that come about?
It was a kind of long, convoluted story, but I'll be honest, he wasn't my number one choice. Well, I'll rewind slightly. My last book, the foreword, was written by another member of that team, Gordon Smith. And I asked Gordon who else in the team he thought might be willing to write a foreword for me, because I didn't want to ask him to write 2 in a row. And he gave me one of the other players' numbers, first and foremost. And but they never responded. And so I'm not going to say who it was. And so I went back to him, and I basically they're not talking to me. He said, "Well, you know what? The one guy who'll definitely do it for you is wee Doddy. Doddy would do anything for any Rangers supporter." So I phoned the Kirkintilloch Rangers Supporters Club, where he is a legend in there, and he invited me up one afternoon, and we spent 2-3 hours up in this upstairs lounge in this Kirkintilloch Rangers Supporters Club, talking about Rangers and talking about his career. What a lovely man! What an absolutely lovely man! And his stories about playing for Rangers are absolutely brilliant. They're brilliant.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure of Doddy's company on a number of occasions, or a couple of occasions at kind of various functions, and he is a thoroughly nice man. There was a time we were trying to get him up here to Aberdeen for an Erskine dinner, and you've always got to book these things well in advance. And he would never come out. But he's getting better at that now as he's getting a bit older. You know, he just didn't want to commit to anything too far in the future. You know, we have had him up since, and I was fortunate enough to be at a tribute dinner for him. I think it was last year in the Sherbrooke Castle, and it was a brilliant night. He's just a fantastic man. Yeah, he's a fantastic man.
I mean, I was going to say, I was asked by a podcast to do my 1 to 11 favourite Rangers team of all time, and it was a younger guy that interviewed me, and he was quite surprised that my number 1 midfield player wasn't Paul Gascoigne, it wasn't Ian Durrant, it wasn't Ian Ferguson, Barry Ferguson, it was Alan McDonald. I thought Alan McDonald was the best all-round midfield player I've ever seen at Rangers. And he didn't think he had this reputation that he deserved the way I spoke about him.
Yeah, unfortunately I don't remember him as a player. I remember him as manager at Hearts. I don't remember him as a player. But I mean, from what I've read about him, video footage that I've seen, talking to folk like yourself, you know, I mean, there's no doubt that, I mean, just the regard he's held in by, you know, guys that do remember him, guys slightly older than me that do remember him. You know, for me, there's no question that he was an absolutely tremendous football player. You know, so that was a forward. Yeah. That's a forward done by Doddy. So why? I know the answer to this because obviously you've done quite a few of these podcasts. We're a bit late to the party, and you've done a few bits. I mean, you've even been on BBC Radio Scotland promoting the book.
Oh, tell me about it.
I'll put my hands up and say I haven't listened to that because I just can't go Stuart Cosgrove. So I haven't. I've listened to most of the rest of them, but
it wasn't too bad.
Go Stuart Cosgrove, so
funnily enough, do you know what? He spoke so warmly about Alec McDonald. Now that you mention him, he doesn't like Rangers, but Alec McDonald started his career at St Johnstone, which was his team.
He did indeed. Yeah.
He kept talking about he was one of the best football players I've ever seen. He kept mentioning that to me. But yeah, it was a different experience doing that. Not one I'm in a hurry to repeat.
No, I mean I've met Tam Cowan a couple of times. He seems alright. He actually rinsed me once at a Hearts supporters club brunch I was at with my girlfriend, and he absolutely ripped me apart. Not because I was a Rangers fan at a Hearts thing, it's just because I was a Rangers fan there, but that's just Tam Cowan. He was quite funny about it, you know. But Cosgrove, I just can't go. But anyway, Why season 77, 78? I mean, there's an awful lot of seasons you could have chosen, an awful lot of good seasons you could have chosen.
I could have done. I think it's actually quite simple, really. There's two main reasons. One is I think it's a season that's not revered, or a team that's not as revered as a lot of teams before and after have been. I think we hear a lot about the Souness teams, the Walter Smith teams, the Barcelona Bears teams, but the two treble teams in the 70s, especially 77, 78, which I thought was the year we played the better football of those two trebles, I don't think get talked about enough. And from a personal point of view, it's my favourite season when I was growing up. It was the first season I was allowed to go to a lot of games with myself. It was the first season I went to most of the away games. I feel as if I kind of bonded with that team, and there was 2 or 3 young players come into it at the same time as that. So I feel as if I sort of watched their entire careers from beginning to end at Rangers. Bobby Russell, David Cooper, Gordon Smith. So it kind of felt kind of like the first team that really belonged to me, if you know what I mean. So yeah, it was a season that meant a lot to me personally, and it was a season I thought Rangers were fantastic in.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite strange. I mean, I agree with you. It is that those two treble teams don't get looked on in the same regard as, you know, the team from Barcelona in 72 and from the Souness team, and even from advocates teams and things like that, which when you consider a lot of the members of the 76 and 78 treble teams were Barcelona Bears, you know, there's still a lot of them still kicking about the team. It's very, very strange that they're not held, to me, that they're not held in the same regard.
Well,
you know, I
think there's a bit of a myth growing up about that team because of Jock Wallace's penchant for getting them running up and down sand dunes and talking about fitness and character and all that sort of stuff. I think it gets overlooked how good a football team they were. Those of us that are old enough to remember the sort of coverage that team got, it was all about how physical they were and how fit they were. But you're talking about guys like Tommy McLean and Davy Cooper and Sandy Jardine, Bobby Russell. You're not talking about a big team of hod carriers. You're talking about really, really good footballers. I think they're horribly underrated.
Yeah, I mean, you've even get guys. I mean, again, it's slightly kind of predates my memory of watching Rangers, and obviously back in the days, we keep saying on these type of pods, you know, back in the day, you didn't get the same coverage you got now. I mean, if you didn't hear it on the news at the time the news was out, you just didn't hear it because you couldn't go back.
No.
And, you know, just go on, I've heard the rumour and just click online and do any of that. You know, so you had to hear it kind of first hand. So you missed a lot of what was going on. No. Certainly I did. You know,
yeah, it's a bit like I was going to that season was even worse for that because there was a TV strike during it, and there was 2 or 3 of the really big performances that team put in that season were never televised. So you actually had to be at the game to have actually appreciated how good they were some of the time.
Yeah, I mean, you were saying there about, you know, about the perception that the Wallace team was all, you know, was all hard men and hod carriers, and I mean, even guys like, you know, John Gregg, Derek Johnson, who featured a lot in this team this season, you know, their reputation was they're just big. I mean, well, Greg would have tackled his granny, and Derek Johnson was just a big lumpy guy that headed balls out. But these guys were really, really good football players at the same time.
Don't get me started on it. Actually, those two are probably the best examples. 77, 78, those two players wrote their name all over it. It was John Gregg's last season as a player, last season as captain before he became manager in the summer. Left back, he scored some great goals. If you look at his Rangers career, he scored more goals than Mark Hateley did. He scored more goals than Colin Steen did. He scored more goals than Derek Parlane did. He didn't take, I think he took about 6 or 7 penalties in 16 years. He was a phenomenon. He was capped as a fullback. He was capped as a centre back. He was capped as a midfield player. He captained Scotland with the guys like Billy Brendan and Billy McNeil to pick from. He was a fantastic footballer. Just because he would have tackled his granny doesn't mean to say he wasn't a fantastic football player. And that's for Derek Johnson. Derek Johnson was my boyhood idol. I could bore people for hours talking about Derek Johnson. When are you ever going to see again a teenager that did what he did, scored in cup finals at centre forward, won medals at centre half, won a European medal at centre half, got capped at centre half, then went back to centre forward and Scotland's top goal scorer. He was absolutely incredible.
Yeah, and then I mean, he was Scotland's top scorer at the end of this season and got taken to the World Cup and never played him, which I still find bizarre. I mean, that's my first World Cup memory, and I just think that's bizarre. But we're not here to talk about that. So having said that, you know, John Greig was one of the mainstays of the team. Having had obviously having had that, I read at the book. I didn't realise that Greig didn't play a lot in the early part of the season.
No, well, he got himself sent off at Pataudry right at the end of the season before and got quite a lengthy suspension. If you remember how suspensions used to work back then, or whether it changed by the time you started, but suspensions used to be in days or weeks rather than in games. And so I can't remember what his suspension was, but just say it was 4 weeks or something like that. It meant that for 4 weeks he couldn't play. So all those games at the start of the season, domestically in the League Cup, etc., he couldn't play anything.
Yeah, but I mean, you can still play in the European games. But yeah, I mean that getting banned for time was a bit weird for me, because obviously if you're going to get a suspension, you wanted it during the winter, because there was quite often a lot of games fell foul to the weather, so you could get a 5-week ban and miss 2 games or whatever, depending on the severity of the winter.
Correct.
You know what I mean?
Which actually happened in 77, 78. There was a couple of freezes during it, and Tom Forsyth actually got a suspension that season that he only missed a couple of games because of it.
Yes, very, very strange, very, very strange old setup. So obviously, you know, the book centres around the treble, which, I mean, the league season didn't start off particularly well. I mean, the season before, just in case people aren't aware, and most people probably should be, as we've said, we won the treble 75-76. And then 76-77, we won absolutely nothing. You know, and then came back and did another treble, which sounds really, really strange. I mean, how can you go from winning everything to winning nothing again? But then we started off the season 2 league defeats away to Aberdeen and at home to Hibs.
Yep. And at the end of 76, 77, I think most of us agreed that we needed more creativity in the team. I think the previous season we relied too much on Tommy McLean. And Jock Wallace done something about it. He went and brought in Davy Cooper for Clydebank. He discovered Bobby Russell from junior football, who came in that season and absolutely was a sensation in it. And he brought in Gordon Smith for Kilmarnock. So he put this fresh blood in at the start of the season. But as you say, the season started really badly with those 2 defeats. And I can still remember the Hibs game, the first home game. The booing in it, the what a rubbish chants, the Wallace must go, all that stuff was at it. He was under a bit of pressure. He was getting asked in the press, are you thinking of resigning? You know, that kind of stuff at that stage of that season. Probably forgotten about now, but it shows you how fickle or how things can turn very quickly in football, because he was under pressure 1 minute, and I would say within about 6 weeks, Rangers were playing some of the best football I've ever seen.
Yeah, and then obviously as the season went on, we got a win at Partick Thistle, and then obviously Celtic came to town. And if Wallace is going to turn the thoughts of people round, you know, that's the best way to do it, is go and beat Celtic. But at half time, that wasn't looking particularly clever.
No, that's one of the absolutely critical games that season. I suppose in a lot of seasons, the first time you play Celtic is usually quite important. But in that particular season, both teams had started really badly. We had lost twice. Actually, Celtic hadn't won a game when they came to Ibrox that day. They were both in the bottom 3. Hard to believe, though, that is. And Derek Parlane played up front that day. Derek Johnson played at the back. And Parlane had a really bad knock to his face in the first few minutes. Celtic scored 2 in the first half. Half time, it was discovered Parlane had actually fractured his cheekbone. Took him off. John Greig, who was a substitute because he was just coming back for suspension, he went in at the back. Derek Johnson got pushed up front, and it was the day that the Derek Johnson, Gordon Smith forward line sort of really clicked into gear that second half. Smith scored twice. Derek Johnson got the middle goal. We beat them 3-2, came back for 2 behind, and that just completely kick-started the season.
Yeah, so thinking back to that day, I know it was a long time ago, but and John Gregg was just coming back from suspension, but he had been playing in the European games, I think I'm right in saying that.
Yeah,
You know, did everybody find it a bit strange that he was left on the bench particularly for a game like that, a game against Celtic, a game that they were in really bad form and we weren't much better.
I think most people would expect him in the team that day. I think that is fair to say. I think most people expected Derek Johnson at centre forward. Johnson had he'd been injured pre-season, and he came into the team just not long before it as a centre forward, and he scored a couple of goals. But the week before, he had moved back to centre half because one of the centre backs was injured. Because that was we could do with a player as versatile as him. He could play either, and we won. And Wallace just left the team alone for the Celtic game. Most of us expected to see Johnson up front and Gregg at the back. And let's be honest, when the team went off 2-0 down at half time, there was quite a few in the terraces were letting the manager know that he thought he'd picked the wrong team. Parline being injured probably made the decision for him. What would he have done it? Maybe, because I think it was crying out to happen anyway. But yeah, it was one of these, I suppose, one of these sliding door moments, wasn't it? That what would have happened if Parline hadn't broke his collarbone in that first half? Would he have changed it? If he hadn't changed it, how would the season have panned out? Who knows?
Well, indeed, yeah, it is a big sliding doors moment. As you say, after that, we went on the form picked up with a couple of draws, but quite a few wins. But what I'm noticing, just looking at the stats in the book, and the book's just to let everyone know, the book's not all just stats. I mean, it's not just stats, it's not just match reports. It's great. I mean, you can explain to them, how you looked at all the games in the sort of detail you put in. But noticeable to me is the crowds weren't very good. Was that because of what had happened the season before, or?
I think if you look at Scottish football in the mid to late 70s, the crowds had went off a cliff edge. Compared to the early 70s, there was probably many reasons for that. I think one of the reasons was quite simply that there was a bit of lack of money going around at the time. I don't know if you remember, there was a lot of strikes in the late 70s. There was a lot of folk losing their jobs in the late 70s. I think money became a bit tighter. Don't forget, that wasn't the time that season tickets had started. So people could pick and choose what games they wanted to go to. So these days, if you get a season ticket, you feel as if you need to go to all the games, really, don't you? Back then, you'd be lucky if Rangers had 3,000 or 4,000 season ticket holders. So it was who wants to go that weekend. I do think the crowds were artificially low because kids could get lifted over the turnstiles. So I think they were probably higher than what it said in the official attendances. And I think the other thing to mention, harsh so it maybe sounds, is that the 70s were a bit of a bad time for hooliganism. And I think a lot of parents started questioning whether they were wanting their kids to go to football games.
Yeah, I can get that because I wasn't. I mean, I was still living in Fort William at the time. My dad not really a football fan, and I was actually to go to games. At this time I was 9. I turned 10 in the summer of '78, and I wasn't allowed to go. And part of the reason I always got told was, "Look at bother. There's going to be trouble. There'll be trouble. There'll be trouble." That's part of the reason I was told I wasn't allowed to go.
Aye, it was the old days that the old terracins, people could take in, drink with them. It was a very different culture at the football back then. But I think a lot of young people probably wouldn't recognise Ibrox Stadium for a start.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was never lucky enough to be in the old Ibrox. It was all seating. They were starting to rebuild the stands by the time I started to go. I remember the enclosure being standing, but that's it.
Yeah, well, that's one of the. I mean, the book's the subtitle "This End of an Era," and there was various reasons for that. So obviously, with Jock Wallace leaving and John Gregg stopping playing was a massive thing. But not just that. It was the last year of the old stadium, so the old Ibrox stopped after that particular season. So it was an era for Rangers that came to an end in 77, 78. Yeah.
So getting back to the book, and I touched on there how how you looked at the games. It's not just stats and match reports. So can you talk
No.
us through,
Yeah.
the
wanted
the way you approached it?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to turn it as best I could into the story of that season. So football seasons aren't just about the games. If you know what I mean. So the games are a massive part. Don't get me wrong. Obviously they are. So what I've done is I've started in the pre-season and worked my way through month by month, week by week, month by month, right to the following May. And it doesn't just cover games themselves, but things that happen in between games. So some player might get injured, or somebody might get transferred, or somebody goes out on loan, or players might go and play for Scotland, because that was also the season that Scotland reached the Argentina World Cup. So Scottish football was very much Ali McLeod in love at that time. We all thought we were going to go to Argentina win the World Cup. There was Rangers players in that, and there was the whole thing about the one weekend there was no game, and they were going down to London to record a World Cup record and all that kind of, there was all this other stuff going on at the time, as well as the off-field things like pitch invasions and SFA hearings into what punishments teams should get. The whole thing was happening then. So I'm trying to build this whole picture of an entire season and what it was like being almost like a Rangers fan living through that year.
Yeah, that certainly comes across in the book. It's not just if you pick it up and each game's obviously listed in it, but it's 2 or 3 pages till you get to the next fixture, if you like. So it's obviously not just a match report. Even if you're just picking up to browse it, you can see just by looking at it, it's obviously not just a match report. It's very, very well done. But having said that, the matches are in detail. But the fact that you put the other stuff round about it, tells you why things have happened.
Yeah.
Like rather than just saying, well, that team against Celtic, John Gregg was on the bench. You've already told us why John Gregg was on the bench, because he's coming back from suspension, etc., which I think is really, really well done.
So one of the ways that I researched the book. Obviously, I remember quite a few of the games, but you've got to research it. You've got to look back and make sure your recollections are right. But rather than just look out match reports and look out old programmes, I tried to find as many of the old newspapers I could, right from Monday to Friday, or Monday to Saturday every week, or Monday to Sunday every week, to see if there was other little snippets happening in between. And I've tried to make sure that comes out in it. And so for example, I'd forgotten in the January, Alec Miller got rushed to hospital and didn't play for a few weeks. I'd forgotten about that. He just disappears for the team line. But he was actually lying in a hospital bed for a week.
So were you aware of that previously? Was it just something you'd forgotten about, or was that common knowledge at the time?
I might have remembered it at the time. I must have known at the time, but things like that get lost. I mean, we're talking 45 years ago, so I'd forgotten that. Suddenly Ali Dawson starts appearing on the bench. You think, why is Alec Miller on the bench? So because he was the usual fullback reserve, so you think, why is he not there? And you find a couple of reports that say Alec Miller got missed Rangers training day, had to get taken to hospital. What? Try and find out more about that.
Yeah. I mean, what I found very interesting, was looking at, some of the players the names that I recognised because I've heard about them and thought they were only like very, very bit. Like, for example, I thought Ali Dawson played more than he did that season, although he was on to say he appeared on the bench, and that's obviously the reason he appeared on the bench. But guys like Johnny Hamilton playing, I thought Johnny Hamilton was like here 1 minute, going the next, and Martin Henderson. These are guys that I'd heard of, but didn't realise that they were still about the club at the time and still featuring then.
Yeah, I think one of the names that appears in it that your good lady will know his brother. So Chris Robertson appears in it a few times. So that's John Robertson's older brother. Yeah, I was coming to him. Yeah. So he was one of the reserve forwards at the time. He was just a young player at the time. He actually came on as a substitute in the previous year's Scottish Cup final against Celtic and nearly scored, actually. He started the following season, he played a couple of games and then just disappeared most of the season, back into the reserves again. And all of a sudden, he was in the bench for the cup final right at the end of the season. So he got a runners-up medal one season and a winners medal the next season, and he hardly played in between.
Yeah, and then just to kind of jump forward a bit from kind of the start of the season where we were and things like that. You know, you mentioned Alec Miller, and you know, in January ended up in the hospital bed. I think what you do really well for me is the way you cover the sad passing of Bobby McKean. You know, in the middle of the March '78. You know, that's one of my. I think that's one of my early Rangers memories, because I don't think it's a learnt memory. I think I do actually remember that happening at the time.
I think it's one of these things that the generation now probably wouldn't believe that this League Cup final went ahead on the Saturday. So Bobby McKean wasn't just some reserve player that hardly played. Bobby McKean was a regular in the Rangers team for 75 to 77. He won 2 league championships. He won the Scottish Cup. And he played quite a number of games at the start of 77-78, although the arrival of David Cooper made him like the third winger in the squad rather than the second one. Tom McLean, if you like, was still the number one winger at Rangers at the time. I mean, he had played, he'd certainly been a substitute just a couple of weeks before he died. His death was a tragedy, God, and it was one of these. I think he obviously he didn't realise. He got locked out of his house. It was cold. It was freezing cold. He decided to sleep in the car in the garage. It was cold, and she turned the engine on and put the heat on. He never realised, obviously. I mean, we all know about carbon monoxide poisoning now, but I don't know how well people knew about it 45 years ago. And it was announced on the Thursday morning that he passed away, age 25. Funny enough, speaking to wee Doddy when we were writing the forward, because we talked about that League Cup. When we talked about that League Cup final, the first thing he actually said was, none of us wanted to play that game. we didn't want to play that game, but that was just the way it was. You just got on with it, didn't you? So you're talking about a guy that had shared the dressing room with all the players, a guy who was a friend to them all, a colleague to them all, an important member of the first team squad, dies on the Thursday, and you've got to play Celtic in a Scottish Cup final 48 hours later.
Yeah, it certainly wouldn't happen now. Certainly wouldn't happen now. You know?
And I think it speaks volumes for some of the character of that team, that they were able to still win the cup on the Saturday, because it must have been okay. There were black armbands. There was a minute's silence, but it must have still been in absolutely the forefront of their minds. It must have been.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's the fact that it was just a couple of days. You know, it wasn't weeks or whatever. You know, it was just 2 days, and he was.
Yeah, the funeral hadn't even happened yet. Yeah.
You know. Yeah. So we won the League Cup in tragic circumstances. Beating Celtic.
Yeah. Well, funny enough, I probably will say though that, in my humble opinion, the best performance they gave all season that year was in another round of the League Cup when they beat Aberdeen 6-1. I think that was the night that for the first time I ever saw 10 outfield players in the one team all clicking at the one time. It was almost like one of these Football Manager computer type performances the first half. Just everybody, it was almost like perfection. 4-0 at half time could have been 10. And Aberdeen were the second best team in the country that season.
Yeah.
In fact, they beat us more often than we beat them. But we absolutely annihilated them that night. And when I talk about the League Cup for that season, I tend to try and concentrate on that game rather than the final. The final wasn't much of a final at all. Yeah,
I mean that Aberdeen game, bizarrely they beat it was all two-legged stuff at the time. Bizarrely they beat us 3-1 in the return leg, which, you know, after beating them 6-1, you would have thought that we'd probably take them to the cleaners. But I would imagine that we maybe kind of, I don't know, did a shadow team or something.
No, but we scored early, made it 7-1 in aggregate, and basically just coasted the rest of the game. And they were just playing for pride, and they just got a little bit of pride back by winning the match. But there was never any danger of Rangers not getting through.
Yeah, I mean, while we're on the League Cup, I don't want to be talking specifically about too many games because obviously we're wanting people to, buy the book and read about the games themselves. But you can't talk about that season's League Cup without mentioning the semi-final against Forfar, which was, on the face of it, 5-2 is a decent result, but I don't think it was as easy as that, was it?
No, Forfar's player manager, of course, was the one and only Archie Knox.
Yep.
Still as a player then, as he had they were in the third tier. He created this team full of experience. I don't know if you remember when you've read about Partick Thistle winning the League Cup back in 1971, but the captain of that Partick Thistle team was in that Forfar team, Alec Ray. Anyway, they went 2-1 up, and there was only 7 minutes left, and we were really up against it. In fact, those of us at Hampden that night genuinely thought we were going to see the biggest embarrassment since Berwick. But luckily we found an equaliser and we ran over the top of them in extra time. But yeah, another one of these sliding doors moments, I suppose, isn't it? So what would have happened that season if we hadn't found an equaliser against Forfar?
Yeah. I seem to remember a couple of years later we struggled to beat Forfar as well. I think that was another semi-final as well, if I remember right.
Yeah, Scottish Cup went to replay.
Scottish Cup, yeah. Yep. So that's, I mean, that was obviously it's a season that you remember fondly. I mean, it's a historic season, but let's not go past it without touching on Europe, because obviously Europe's a big thing for the club now. And the following season was really big in Europe, but this season wasn't particularly clever.
No, I think potentially, I think the three new players weren't quite ready for Europe then. Russell, Smith, and Cooper. They were. I think they were 21 years old each, round about. So with these youngsters bedding in, we beat Young Boys of Switzerland in the first round, preliminary round, and Derek Johnson gets sent off towards the end of the second game, and he gets suspended for the 2 games against FC 20, the Dutch team. So he couldn't play. Derek Parlin broke his jaw, so he didn't play in one of the games either. So we ended up with third and fourth choice forwards playing. And I think, to be fair, although it's not a name that people will remember, particularly FC 20, they got to the semi-final that season, and the 2 guys they had in their midfield, Arnold Muir and Franz Tyson, ended up both going to Ipswich under Bobby Robson and helping Ipswich win the UEFA Cup and almost win the English League Championship. They were terrific players. So I think there was 2 or 3 right good players in that Dutch team. Yeah. But yeah, we didn't do too well in Europe that season.
But it didn't derail the domestic stuff, which is always good, and which is obviously the point of the book. So having touched on obviously the league, because as I say, I don't want to speak about too many of the games specifically, because that's people need to buy the book to find out about that. But yeah, so the Scottish Cup, obviously we won the League Cup, beating Celtic in the final, and then obviously we won the league in the last, I think, if I remember, the last day of the season.
It was
before we actually clinched the league.
It was the last day of the season. Well, funny enough, when you talk about treble seasons, usually you think in your head about how you just steamroll the opposition and win all the trophies. But that season started really badly, as you mentioned. We then played brilliantly, built up quite a big lead in the league. There was only 2 points for a win back then. We were 6 points in front, and we had a game in hand. So we were the equivalent of 8 points in front. And it ended up Aberdeen caught us. And with a few games left, we had to win the game in hand to go back in front again. So you can see this. We had this huge wobble. We lost a couple of games. We drew 2 or 3 really bad games. Games we should never have drawn. And the pressure was back on in the run-in, as you say, and it ended up, it came right towards the end. I actually think the man that made it come right was John Gregg. He scored a couple of really important goals in the space of a few days. And then he had his testimonial, and we played Scotland. They beat Scotland 5-0 in his testimonial, and it was almost as if the pressure was off the team that day, and they found their mojo again. And they were able to then win all the games they run in after that.
Yeah. That John Gregg testimonial, that was the biggest crowd of the season, wasn't it?
It was. I think it was the first. He was the first Rangers player to get a testimonial since Davy Meikle, John. So Rangers have stopped doing testimonials.
Oh.
But I think if ever a man was going to get one, it was going to be him. And as you say, it was a complete sellout. I got 65,000, which was more than even the Scottish Cup final at Hampden got and the League Cup final at Hampden got. It was the biggest crowd in Scotland that season.
Yeah, which just tells you the esteem that John Gregg was held in, you know.
Yeah.
And the fact that they played against Scotland as well, because could you imagine a testimonial today for anybody against the Scotland national team?
That's one of these things. Been, as I said at the time, everyone was a Scotland fan then. Everyone was a Scotland fan.
Yeah.
Alan McLeod had everybody talking about the Scotland team. Andy Cameron was making records about them. Rod Stewart, who at that time was a Scotland fan rather than a Celtic fan, he was in John Gregg's testimonial committee. He was getting his picture taken with John Gregg with his Rangers top on and stuff like that. So it was changed days.
Yeah, I remember Ali McLeod whipping everybody up because I certainly bought into it, you know. In fact, just as an aside, I remember before Scotland went to the World Cup, they did the Sunday Mail did this phone thing that you could phone in and speak to one of three members of the squad, and one of them was Tom Forsyth. I can't remember who the other two were. And the reason I remember it was Tom Forsyth, I was 9 years old, coming up 10, and I actually spoke to him, and I was shaking like a leaf. I can't even remember what I said to him, but it must have been something ridiculous. But this is just something that they were. So that's how invested everybody was in, the Scotland national team. You had national newspapers organising players to receive phone calls from the public, just to wish them well or whatever, or ask them questions, and it was just, and that record we'll not talk about Ali starting armies as a record. You know what I mean? The B side was better, So
I want to be a punk rocker.
That's the very one. I'm impressed you know that. Yep, that's the very one. Yep, but my mammy won't let me.
You can tell I had the record. That's the one.
Right, I think I've probably still got it somewhere. So the Scottish Cup. Obviously, we closed that off. I think that was a fairly straightforward run to the final. Or am I doing the run of this service?
Well, I think what one of the things about that season was how bad Celtic were. Celtic were terrible that season. In fact, it got to about March before people stopped talking about relegation with Celtic, because they were only 2 and 3 points above the bottom two getting into March that year. So Rangers actually drew Celtic in the Scottish Cup in the quarter-final, but it was Rangers versus Kilmarnock or Celtic, because they had still to play, and Kilmarnock beat them in a replay. So we didn't have to play Celtic. Kilmarnock played at Ibrox, and their centre forward was Colin Stein, who we gave them on loan for that season. Do you remember he had this great welcome at Ibrox that day? But you see, it was a pretty straightforward run. We played Berwick again 10 years to the day after they beat us. We welcomed Colin Stein to Ibrox in the quarterfinals. We beat Dundee United in the semi-final. They were a good team then. That was just the beginning. You could see they were going to become a really good team. Davy Neri, Paul Hegarty, Paul Sturrock, they were all starting to appear in the Dundee United team. In the final against Aberdeen, most people actually had Aberdeen as the favourites, even though we had just won the league and the League Cup, because they had beaten us the last 3 times they had played us, and they'd hammered us the last twice they had played us, 4-0 and 3-0. They hadn't lost a game since the December. We had with this big wobble. The bookies had us more or less even. All the pundits and the papers were pretty split about it. But Rangers were by far the better team in the cup final. We totally deserved to win it. And Bobby Russell was absolutely outstanding.
Yeah, Peter McCloy swinging off the crossbar and all that sort of stuff. I remember that. That's
I know.
Scottish Cup.
But it's terrible. I know it's terrible how many people talk about that as being that cup finals memorable moment. I prefer to remember the 2-headed goals we scored.
Yeah, that cup final was very nearly my first ever game. I believe my dad had still lived in Fort William at the time, and my dad had come home and he'd said that he'd been. And I don't know how they sold cup final tickets then, but there was somewhere in Fort William that were selling cup final tickets. I have no idea where it was or why it was. And he was standing in a queue to buy these tickets, and somebody said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm going to take the boy to football. It's on the telly." And he went, "Ah, well, I walked away." Just he was watching the telly, and he told me, and I don't think I spoke to him for about 3 weeks. And I think the only reason I started speaking to him was it was my birthday coming up, so I thought I better start speaking to this guy here. So that could have been my first game, but unfortunately it wasn't.
I remember you used to get cup final tickets and Scotland game tickets and travel agents. So see if the town you were in had a travel agent in it. Quite often they had football tickets.
Yeah.
I can't remember when that stopped, but
yeah, I've got no idea where he was, but I know he said he was standing in a queue, and somebody that he knew walked past him. What are you queuing up for? And they said, "Oh, it's on the telly." So that was him. So that was me. That could have been my first game, but unfortunately it wasn't. It was a few years later. But yeah, back to the book. I mean, the book for me, very, very interesting. It's a season that I've got vague recollections of, but it just puts it all, puts it all together, packages it up very, very nicely. The way you've approached it is, for me, really good with the information between the games and what happened. Rather than just match reports, because you can just go online and get match reports. You know what I mean?
Well, I don't know if you'll get them for back then, but yeah, I think there's. I mentioned earlier on about I thought this team's got this reputation that's undeserved of being a big physical. I think Jock Wallace is the same. I think his reputation is not where it should be amongst football people. If I look back to Jock Wallace's teams, they were very attacking and entertaining. Even though they had defenders that could defend, they had guys that could tackle and win the ball, absolutely, and they were fit. He almost always played with two wingers. And the team that particular season, when he brought Gordon Smith in, we all thought Gordon Smith was a winger when he played for Kilmarnock. And he just brought Davy Cooper. I mean, why is he buying another winger? He had spotted Smith years ago as this kind of attacking midfield player. Well, I think these days they call it a number 10 or something, don't they? One of these players that play just off the front. And that was the first team I can ever remember seeing that played the system that's now called 4-2-3-1. Everybody plays that now. Most teams regard that as modern football. But when I look back at it now, Derek Johnson played up front. There was two wingers and Gordon Smith as a three just off him. And there was Bobby Russell and Alan McDonald behind them in a back four. So it was actually, I don't know, the Michael Beale or Steven Gerrard system 45 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, Gordon Smith says that himself if you hear him talking about it, which I'm sure you have. And he says, when Jock Wallace signed him, he says, why you've got these, you've just signed Davy Cooper, you've got these, he says, I'm going to play as a midfield player. And he went, great, because that's where I want to play. But it's not where he had been playing, you know what I mean? So which tells you a lot about Big Jock's ability to spot a players, And I believe he chased him quite a bit as well, because he said he finally got him the third or fourth attempt.
Yeah, he was somebody he wanted for a while. And he actually said in an interview years later that Gordon Smith was his best ever signing for Rangers. Which when you think he signed Davy Cooper, is a hell of a compliment. Gordon himself, that's his greatest compliment in football. He'll tell him that listen. He'll tell them that he's so proud of that. And certainly Smith made a huge difference that season. Huge difference.
Yep. So did, as you say, the other two signings, Davy Cooper and Bobby Russell. Taking them out the juniors. Again, something else that would never happen these days. Taking a player out the juniors and making the amount of appearances that Bobby Russell made. So looking back on the season as a whole, and trying to compare it to the treble season of two seasons before. What do you think the biggest difference was? Because obviously you witnessed them both, and you chose to write the book on this one as opposed to the last one. So, or the one previous to that. So, what do you think the biggest difference between the two seasons is?
I think the main difference was the style of football. I think they had a more sort of fluid, entertaining style of football that season. If you think back to 75-76, Rangers actually didn't start 75-76 very well either, but they went in this brilliant run from sort of just before Christmas onwards. I don't think they didn't lose a game to about mid-December onwards in 75-76. That was the season that Martin Henderson and Derek Johnson played up front. They were a far more direct team in 75-76. Probably because they had two big guys up front. I think they bypassed the midfield more in 75-76. They were certainly effective, but I don't think they were as entertaining to watch. And maybe I'm a little bit coloured on it, if you like, biased on it, simply because I saw more games of 77, 78 than I saw in 75, 76. But I certainly thought that they were a team that the fans connected to better.
Yeah, I get that. So before we go, something I've just noticed looking at the appearances was the fact that the two goalkeepers that kind of split the season between them. And I didn't read the book. I didn't really pick up on that Peter McCloy and Stuart Kennedy sort of split the season between them. So which one was the better goalkeeper?
Well, which one was the better goalkeeper that season, or which one was the better goalkeeper? Full stop.
In your opinion, which one was the better goalkeeper? Full stop. And that season, if it's a different answer, and that season.
Well, I think that you can't really argue with a Rangers goalkeeper that played for 16 seasons, and every manager for 16 seasons gave him the jersey, against a guy that was probably first choice for no more than 1 or 2 seasons in his Rangers career. So over the piece, you can't say Peter McCloy wasn't the better Rangers goalkeeper, because 500 he played more games than Alan McGregor, for goodness sake. You can't really say that he's not that. I think the one thing that both Peter McCloy and Stuart Kennedy unfortunately had was a mistake in them, and that's what happened that particular season. McCloy started it in goal, and he made a couple of really bad mistakes, and he gave a terrible goal away at Paisley, and he got dropped, and Stuart Kennedy came in, and he played well for a while, and then he made a couple of really terrible mistakes. Unfortunately, 2 of them were against Celtic, the League Cup final, then the following week we lost at Parkhead, and that let McCloy come back in again. But if I'm talking great Rangers goalkeepers, although McCloy had all those appearances, I don't regard either of them as great Rangers goalkeepers. Stuart Kennedy had one brilliant season, 74-75, when he became Scotland's keeper. He was never the same after that Wembley disaster he had.
Yeah.
But I think Rangers, in my view, Rangers goalkeeping changed when Chris Woods arrived. He was the first goalkeeper I ever saw that I thought, what a goalkeeper he is.
Okay, so getting back to just before I let you go, and once again, thanks for joining us, Davey. It's been absolutely brilliant.
No problem.
Looking at the 77-78 as a season, right? Who was your player of the season? Who do you think's the main reason that we were so successful? Other than Big Jock, you've got to say it's all down to him. But from the players' point of view, who do you think? Not particularly who's your favourite player from it, but who do you think would have been player of the year by performances or whatever?
See, if I take myself back to 14-year-old me, at the end of that season, there was 2 players in that team that I thought were the reason why we won the treble. The obvious one was Derek Johnson, because he scored 40 goals. He couldn't stop scoring. He was an absolute force of nature that season. He went through this period of time that he scored almost every game. He won the Player of the Year in Scotland. He won the first ever Scottish Players Player of the Year that season as well. I think that was peak DJ that season. I don't think we ever saw him as good as that again. So the easy answer is Derek Johnson. But I personally think the guy that made the biggest difference from the season before, and the guy that really made them tick every time they played really well, the guy that played really well was Bobby Russell. I thought Bobby Russell was absolutely sensational that season. And he was this player that sat right in the middle of the park and just done the right thing all the time. He found his own players. He won the ball. He kept it simple, kept possession. He was just a terrific midfield player. And I think because nobody had ever heard of him before the season had started, he made such an impression that year. He won the man of the match in the cup semi-final and the cup final. He I don't think they did man of the match awards in league games back then, but if they had, he would probably have won at least 15 or 20 of them. He was sensational.
Yeah, I had a feeling that was going to be your answer, to be honest, from what I've heard of the season and things like that. But yeah, fabulous. Right, Davey, once again, thanks very much for your time. So, folks, the book is 1977 to 78, a historic season for Rangers FC and a treble that ended an era. So, Mr. Herd, where can people find your book?
Where you can find most books. So, if you want to buy it in person, actually pick it up and look at it and decide whether you want it or not, it's in the vast majority of the larger Waterstones stores in Scotland. So I was actually in Glasgow today, and I saw one in a Waterstones for the first time, which gave me a little buzz. So Waterstones is the easiest one to get if you want to actually physically get it. If you want to buy it online, there's loads. Waterstones, W.H. Smith, straight direct for the publisher, which is Pitch Publications. Or I suppose the one most people would buy from is Amazon, isn't it? And I know that Amazon are selling it just now slightly below the recommended price plus free postage. So actually the cheapest way of getting it right now is from Amazon as well.
Okay, and the recommended price is, I'm just looking for it here because I can't remember, 18.99.
It's 19 quid, yeah. I know that it's a wee bit.
Yeah.
Hardback books like this are a wee bit expensive, I do think that, but I think Amazon are selling it for 16 at the moment.
It's worth every single penny, even if you've got to pay the full back for it, because it really is a very, very good book. And again, this is something that I do know the answer to. You've done 3. I'm sure there's a 4th one in the offing. Yeah, well,
the wife isn't retiring yet, so I need to keep myself busy. I've got to know through my first book. I've got to know the family of a Rangers legend from the 30s and 40s called Torry Gillick, a man who's obviously no longer with us, but his family, his son and daughter and granddaughter are still very much with us, and I've got to know them. And we've agreed that I'm going to try and do justice to his life and career by doing a biography of him. So myself and a fellow Rangers author called Ian Stewart, who wrote Tiger Shaw's biography, are going to attempt to do justice to them, because the more we read about him and find out about him, not only had he an incredible football career, he had an incredible life as well. So we're going to try and do justice to it. We've started it, and I'm hoping if we're following wind, we can maybe get something ready for our publisher to look at in the next 3-4 months.
Good, that's good. Look for that. That should be good. I've got Ian's previous book, and it's a really good read. I mean, I just love reading. I'm not a big book reader, as I've told you previously. I just love reading books about Rangers. I mean, I do eventually get into reading them all, although I've bought a few that I haven't even opened yet. But I mean, my good lady, she's another book that will just sit there and gather dust. But but I do eventually get into reading them all. So we say this is your 3rd book. I'm definitely going to let you out here on this one. Remind everybody of what your other 2 books are, because they can get them while they're on Amazon. They might as well just buy the 3 at the same time.
Oh yeah, well, they're on Amazon. Yeah, well, the first book was called 1872, Stories of Rangers Players of Yesteryear. It was basically a series of very short biographies of 72 Rangers players that played in the first half of Rangers history, so up until the late 1940s. And the second one was called Kings of the League Cup, about the 27 times that Rangers have won that trophy. Unfortunately, I didn't get right in the 28th chapter this year. I'm hoping to write the 28th chapter next year, but at the moment you can read about the 27 times which we won it, which is still by far the most of any Scottish football club, and it's the story of all those 27 League Cup winning campaigns.
Yep, so there you go, folks. That's three books to get. If you don't have the other 2, just go on to your book retailer, put in David Herd Rangers, and they'll all pop up, and they'll keep you going through the summer when there's no football to watch. So once again, Davey, absolute pleasure to speak to you. Thank you very much for joining us here on the Rangers Rabble, and hopefully we'll speak to you again very soon about your Torry Gillick book. Thanks, folks.
Right, thanks very much, Rolf. Cheers.